So it's funny because as I was planning what I was going to say to introduce Derek, I was just reading the profile of him that was just recently published on the SIGPlan blog, and in which he mentioned his huge collection of whiskey. But I wasn't ready for him to actually have that whiskey collection on display behind him on video. But that makes it even more delightful. So Derek's one of the most prolific publishers in our community. He's also a great person, and he's a wonderful person to talk to about food and drink, and movies, as well as programming languages research. And he writes great papers. So this is a talk that he's given several times at PLMWs, but we're very excited to welcome him back to give the talk again. And I hope that you will be able to get some actionable advice out of his talk. Take it away, Derek.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. That was a lovely introduction. Can everyone hear me and see the slides? If you can't, then great. Okay.
I can hear you and see. Yeah.
Terrific. Okay, so yeah, it's my pleasure to be talking to you at this first virtual PLMW. I think this is the first, at least first virtual PLMW at ICFP, and talking to you about something I care a lot about, which is communication skills, and in particular writing skills. I have been a faculty member at the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems for the last 12 and a half years. And my job title officially is full-time independent researcher. Let's see, there we go. Is full-time independent researcher. So you might think that being a full-time independent researcher means that I get to do, independent research full-time. But you would be mistaken, because in fact, there's a lot more to the job than just that. Of course, that's what many of us do. That's the thing that we get excited about, is doing exciting new research together with our students. But at the end of the day, you have to eventually communicate that research to other people. And that typically takes two forms. First, once you get your research into the form of some kind of publishable unit, then you write a paper, you submit it to a conference like ICFP. And if you're lucky enough to get it accepted, then you go to the conference, or you, in our current situation, you stay home and you give a talk about your paper for the audience of the PL community, and then you get feedback from that, and you go back and take that as a jumping off point for doing further research, and the cycle continues. So although I of course spend a lot of time working on research these days, particularly since I have several students and they're really pushing ahead on the technical work for the most part, I actually spend a lot of time thinking about these bottom 2 points on the triangle. How can we better communicate? How can I help my students better communicate the results in writing papers and in giving talks? And today I'm going to be focusing on writing papers. So I should say, by the way, a lot of researchers I find are perhaps not as excited about these bottom 2 points on the triangle. They really, they're more in it for the research itself. And of course I care about the research as well. But to me, the point when you actually start writing the paper is the most exciting part, because that's where you finally start to understand what it is you really did, where the work really becomes crystallized, not only for other people, but also for yourself. So with that said, let's get started. So I'm going to start out with a question, and this will be our first test of this new Clowder system, I guess, which is, how many of you have read any research papers lately? I know you come from a broad set of backgrounds. So maybe if you have read a research paper, in the last year, then write Q in the Clowder window. Okay, they're coming in. They're coming in. Oh, they're coming in fast and furious now. Okay, this is good. So a lot of you have read. Oh wow. All right. Okay, lots of people have read a research paper. Excellent. All right. Okay, you can stop. You can stop. You can stop. Okay, good. Terrific. So now, how many of you who have read a research paper have thrown up your hands in bewilderment because you had no idea what was going on? So maybe to distinguish this from the first one, write B for bewilderment. Ah, okay, the Bs are now, oh, there's a lot of Bs too, okay. Yes, don't be afraid, you can write a B, there's plenty of other people. Yeah, okay, excellent. So, great. So yes, well, welcome to my world, because you may think that it's just because you're starting out in research or just getting your feet wet that you have trouble following research papers. And that could be part of the reason, but really, the truth is many papers are poorly written. And so this is a problem even for senior people in the field. When we're reading papers, when we're reviewing papers, we're constantly struggling with trying to understand what people are doing, okay? And I think to a large extent that is because of lack of writing skills. So as a consequence, if you can write clear, accessible papers, well, several wonderful things will happen, okay? First of all, people will enjoy reading your papers. People will actually learn something from your papers. They'll get accepted to top conferences at sort of alarmingly high rates. You'll become famous. Your work will have a lot of impact. You'll make a lot of money. Well, I don't know, maybe not the money. Okay, I'm not sure about that. But in general, wonderful things will happen for your life in general, I think, if you can write more clearly and accessibly. And so in this talk, I'm going to try to focus on what can we do what are some actionable advice I can give you towards writing papers that are above average. So let me focus first on what the problem is. Right? Why is this difficult? And that's shown by this picture here. So this is a picture of what typically is the experience between the writer and the reader, right? So you're writing a paper and you're trying to communicate about a piece of research, which is shown, depicted here in the middle as this kind of complicated gadget. And you're very excited about this piece of research and you want to tell the reader everything about it, okay? So you go ahead and tell everything about it. So you say, oh, well, by downcasting the pre-axial gaskets, we're going to achieve some reduction in the XPS latency on this bivalve, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what a lot of papers read like, okay? And what is the reader thinking on the other side? They're thinking, well, okay, that fine, but what does it actually do, first of all, and why do I care about that? And maybe if I can understand what this thing is supposed to do and why, why these complications are there, then maybe I would be interested in understanding some details about those complications. And the reason this is so hard, I think, for many writers to grasp is because of something that Steven Pinker has called the curse of knowledge, which I think is a very nice phrase. It suggests that basically, because the writer knows so much about what they're doing, they have a hard time imagining what it's like to be someone who doesn't. And so they just can't get outside of their own head and think in terms of, what would someone, how could I explain this to someone who doesn't understand everything already? And so the question is, how can you circumvent that curse of knowledge? So the good news is there are principles you can follow that will help you avoid that curse of knowledge, that will help you write clearer, more readable prose. And they're based on an understanding of how readers process information. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So when I say that I'm going to teach you some principles of good writing, of clear writing, is there any text that some common recommended text that people have had recommended to them? If you want, you can write this in the Clouder chat if anyone has any text that's been recommended, some very common text. Bird by Bird, okay, I actually don't know that text. Elements of Style, yeah, okay, so it was, Elements of Style was the one I was expecting, yeah. Right, so Strunk and White's The Elements of Style is a very widely recommended book, very famous, and I really don't like it. Oh, I see someone said Style by Williams is great. Yes, I'll get back to that in a minute, actually. I'm still getting used to, by the way, giving talks where I can actually simultaneously see text comments about the talk I'm giving at the moment, but I'll try to ignore that. Anyway, so Strunk and White is this famous book, but I really don't like it. Why don't I like it? Well, basically because I find that the most famous bits of advice from this book are not actionable. So these are in particular these kind of aphorisms like be clear and omit needless words. You know, I've often heard advisors say, "Oh yeah, my students write too many. You know, it's write too much. I have to write, you know, cross off every other word." And my experience is that that's not so helpful, because that doesn't really tell the student which of their words need to be crossed out. Okay, if the student knew which words they didn't need, then they wouldn't have written it there in the first place. Okay, and if they knew which, you know, whether their writing was clear, then they wouldn't need the book. So so I'm not going to be focusing on the sort of Strunk and White style advice. Instead, I'm going to try to give you some principles that are constructive, in the sense that, first of all, it's easy to check if your text satisfies these principles. And if your text does not satisfy these principles, then the principles suggest concrete ways of improving your text. Okay. I should say up front that this is what I'm going to talk about is a sort of a combination of various ideas that come from a number of very useful sources I recommend you take a look at. The first and foremost one is Joseph Williams' book, Style Toward Clarity and Grace, which someone mentioned in the chat. So this is a great book. It's not really about scientific writing specifically, but it's one of the best books I know about writing. And it's freely available online. You can Google for it, you'll find the PDF. There's also some course notes by Norman Ramsey. I think someone else also mentioned that in their, or maybe they mentioned something from Norman Ramsey in their in the chat. That's also really good. That's online. And Simon Peyton-Jones, as many of you may know, he's a leading light in the ICFP community especially, and he has a talk on how to write a great research paper, and also one on how to give a great talk. I highly recommend both of those, and you'll find them online. So, oh, and before I continue, I should say also, everything I'm talking about today is really developed jointly with my partner, Rose Hoberman, who works at the Max Planck Institute 2 doors down from me on my floor, teaching courses in communication skills and helping students write better papers and give better talks. So without further ado, I'll go on. And the structure of this talk is basically, I'm going to first start with low-level writing, sentences and paragraphs. And for about half the time, I'll talk about that. And then the other half, I'll talk about higher level writing. How do you structure a conference paper, which is the sort of predominant means of communication that we have. Are there any questions so far? Okay, good. So I'm gonna give you a couple principles. There's a lot to say about writing in general and low-level writing. But I'm going to focus on what I think are the most important, handful of principles that will really, if you can grasp these principles, it'll really improve your writing. The first one, and the most important one, the one I see violated the most especially in student writing, is something called flow. So the idea of flow is that it should be clear how each sentence and paragraph in your paper relates to the ones that come before and after. And so the reason for this, of course, is, again, you want to lead the reader along, right? If you think about that gap between the writer and the reader's over there and you're over here, and you want to sort of pull the reader along this chain. And if you have a break in your text where suddenly the reader doesn't understand how what they're reading relates to what came before, then they can get very confused, and they start to tune out, and they start to get, to not understand what you're talking about. So let me give you a concrete example of this. So I'm going to read you a paragraph. You'll see the paragraph on this slide. And I want you to think, is there some point at which this text stops flowing? Security proofs of cryptographic protocols are crucial for the security of everyday electronic communication. However, these proofs tend to be complex and difficult to get right. The game playing technique, originally proposed by Jones et al., follows a code-based approach where the security properties are formulated in terms of probabilistic programs called games. This is a general design principle for cryptographic proofs to ease their management. So if you want to suggest where the sentence broke down, write Q in the chat. I mean, where the paragraph broke down. Gergely. You have to unmute yourself. Or Bukesh.
It's broken at the game playing technique.
Okay, and why?
So first two sentences are connected, but then it certainly introduces this thing, a notion called game playing technique, which has no connection to the previous two sentences.
Right. Yes, exactly. So indeed, this is the sentence where things start to break down, and it's because what does this thing have to do with what came before? So thank you very much. So yeah, I've given this talk, by the way, a number of times. Someone always gets this right because it's a universal, you know, anyone reading this text will find that's where things break down. And it's very easy to diagnose this using a principle that I call old to new. So the idea is that sentences should begin with old information and end with new information. And this serves several functions. One is when you start the sentence, you're creating an explicit link to the text that came before. So you're not letting the reader sort of, you know, fall into the chasm. And secondly, by ending the sentence with new information, you're creating number one, you're creating a link to the text that follows, but you're also putting new information in a position of emphasis, because readers naturally, when they're reading a sentence, they're sort of, you know, building up tension until they get to the very end. And so there's a lot of emphasis naturally put in the reader's mind on what comes at the end of the sentence. So you want to put the sort of the payload of the sentence at the end. So now with this principle in mind, let's go back and just apply it to this paragraph. And you'll see that the problem was that the game playing technique was new information that was introduced at the beginning of a sentence, okay? And so it's sort of, as you're reading it, it just sort of comes out of nowhere, even though there is enough information in the paragraph to understand eventually how it relates to what came before. But at the point where it arrives, it doesn't really belong. So here's a way you could fix this paragraph to more explicitly solve old to new. So the first two sentences I left the same, right? However, these proofs tend to be complex and difficult to get right. To make it easier to manage such proofs, Jones et al. Have proposed a new design principle called the game playing technique. This technique follows a code-based approach where the security properties are formulated in terms of probabilistic programs called games. And if you diagram this, if you do an old to new diagram on this paragraph, you'll see that indeed every sentence begins with old information, these proofs, such proofs, this technique, and the key payload of actually the whole paragraph, which is this gameplay technique, appears at the end of the third sentence in the position of emphasis. So this, if you just start thinking about your paragraphs in this way, or actually your sentences, then you'll find that this is a very easy thing to check for. And if people are getting confused, maybe this is a first place to look as a first principle to try to enforce. However, it's not enough. So I mean, just enforcing flow is not enough. There's other things you also have to enforce. And to give you an example of that, I'm going to show you another paragraph, and we'll see that this paragraph has great flow, but it has another problem. So I'm going to read this paragraph again. And I want you to tell me I want you to raise your hand if you have a thought about what is wrong with it. Lions and tigers are some of the most dramatic and awe-inspiring species of cats. Most of these large cats, however, are currently facing extinction. A smaller cat that has been more evolutionarily successful is the house cat. Although house cats are currently the most popular pet in the world, they are in many ways antisocial. It would therefore be interesting to study whether house cats can be trained to be more sociable. So write Q if you have an idea of what's wrong with this. James Cooper.
Oh, well, it seems to me, am I coming through?
Yep.
Okay, great. Seems to me that basically it starts off talking about lions and tigers, and then seemingly the rest of it has nothing to do with them. So it's kind of
yes.
Extraneous.
Yeah.
I'd say.
Yes. So yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
That's it starts off in one place and ends up some other place. So altogether, there's no the key thing is it's incoherent. Okay. It has, but notice, by the way, it does have great flow. So every sentence, it perfectly follows old to new. So as you go along, you're following the chain, but then at the end you say, well, what was the point of that? So this is the problem of coherence. So your text not only has to have great flow, but it should be coherent, meaning that it should be clear how every sentence relates to the point of the paragraph that it's in, and more generally, how every paragraph relates to the point of the section that it's in, how every section relates to the point of the paper that it's in. So you should always be able to, the reader should never feel like, I don't know where I am in this paper or in this paragraph or at any level of granularity. And so how can you enforce coherence? So the simple principle that I like to follow is something called one paragraph, one point. So the idea is that a paragraph should have one main point. I mean, it can have some other points, but it should have one main purpose, and that should be expressed in a single sentence called the point sentence. Now, this sentence could appear in different places, but typically, and it's sort of, my recommendation, especially people who are just starting to get right doing scientific writing, is to try to put that point sentence at or near the beginning of the paragraph. It doesn't always have to be the very first sentence. Sometimes you can have a sort of initial section of the paragraph, the first 2 or 3 sentences where you're building up to that point sentence. But that's an ideal place for it, and it's because of something I call sort of the theorem proof model of paragraphs, which is each paragraph sort of has a theorem which is building up to the statement of the point sentence, which may again take a few sentences to get to, and then the rest of the paragraph is kind of proof or more generally evidence that's backing up that point. There are alternative approaches where you can. I mean, there are some times when I do put a point sentence at the end of a paragraph. But this requires more finesse. So I would say in general, try to put it early in the paragraph. So let's go back to this paragraph. So the problem, of course, the problem is the paragraph has no point, right? So obviously it has no point sentence because there's no point. So to fix this, to fix coherence problems typically requires more serious rewriting than flow problems. Because often it means you haven't, your thought is not clear. And so you have to really think about what you're trying to say. So I'm going to rewrite the paragraph to something that's somewhat related, but has a point. There appears a relation between the charisma of a species and its ability to survive. Lions and tigers, for instance, are among the most majestic creatures in the animal kingdom, yet they are currently facing extinction. In contrast, the house cat is evolutionarily quite successful, even though it is mostly known for stupid pet tricks. So here again, you see the theorem proof model. So the first sentence establishes the theorem of the paragraph, the point, and the second 2 sentences are backing that up. Okay. So are there any questions about, yes, a lot of anti-house cat sentiment here. Yes, indeed. So are there any questions about flow or coherence? All right, then I will move on. So to summarize, right, you create flow using the old to new principle, and you create coherence with one paragraph, one point. And if you just follow these 2 principles, you'll already be improving your text a lot. I actively think about using these principles all the time when I'm editing my students' text, and when I'm writing my own text. I often, I sort of draft a paragraph and I realize, oh, I'm not sure, this sort of went on too long and I don't know exactly what the point is. Let's restructure this so that there's a clear point sentence, preferably early in the paragraph. Now, there's a number of other principles that are also useful that I don't have as much time to go into, but I just want to mention them. So 2 others that I find come up all the time. One is called name your baby. So basically, the issue here is that frequently you have various things you're talking about a lot in your paper, and it's good to give these things names. And people do give them names, but the problem is that sometimes people use one name to refer to multiple different concepts, or they refer to one concept with multiple different names, and they sort of do it interchangeably. And this can be very confusing to the reader because if they see different names, they assume most of the time that they're actually talking about different things. And so, so the name your baby principle is simply that you should give unique names to the important, subjects in your paper. Like your type system or your important concepts in the mechanism behind your paper, and you should use those names consistently. The second of these principles is just in time, and here the issue has to do with how do you present background information. So frequently, you can't just say exactly what you want to say immediately. You have to give the reader some background to sort of build up enough knowledge that they can appreciate what you're going to tell them. This is particularly the case for work in more technical or formal work, where there's really a lot of background that needs to be understood before the reader can understand your new contribution. And so students frequently think they need to have a section on background where they sort of, it often occurs early in the paper, and it's just this long section that's kind of dry and that's presenting prior work, and just telling the reader all about this stuff that came before without a very clear eye towards what the reader needs to understand. And this is always a mistake because you can, if you just tell the reader all this background information, they're going to forget it by the time they actually need to know it. So the just-in-time principle is basically that you should give the reader the information they need to know precisely at the point when it's needed and not before. And sometimes that means you have to break up the information, or you give less information, or you give that information at a higher level of abstraction or something. But you shouldn't feel the need to just dump a bunch of information about prior work up front because then the reader won't remember it when it comes time to use it. So these two are the big principles, I think. Let me take a quick look here regarding the just-in-time principle. What do we do if there is a required paper structure imposed? Well, so I don't know. I have never written a paper where there was a required paper structure imposed. So I don't. In general, you're at least with conferences like ICFP and the other SIGPlan conferences like POPL, PLDI, OOPSLA. Actually, any conference that I've ever seen in programming languages, there's no official paper structure. So then this is not an issue. And is this background section the same as the related work section? That's a very good question, and I will come back to that later in the talk. When I talk about paper structure. Okay. And
could I jump in? There's actually a question that I think that was previous. Students are sometimes taught to read papers by doing multiple passes.
Yes.
Do you have any advice on narrative structure to match that kind of reading strategy? This is from Yuan Kao.
Oh, I see. I think I wouldn't worry about, I think that generally you should write for the people who are reading it front to back, and not worry about people who will jump around. I mean, people will always jump around, and there's not much you can do about that. The best thing to do is make sure that if someone is reading it as a paper from cover to cover, then they're not going to tune out too early. And that's in fact going to be an important consideration in my advice about paper structure. Okay, great. So I'll move on. So I was actually going to say there's 3 other principles. So there's a bonus principle that I added at the last minute, which is just a short principle from Rose. She has told me that this comes up all the time, and I've observed it as well. But she in particular said it comes up all the time in student writing, which is short subject. So the idea is that many students often, not just students actually, everybody often has sentences that have very long subjects. And the problem with a very long subject is that in English, naturally, when you're reading, you sort of want to get to the verb. You want to know what is happening in the sentence. And if the subject is too long, then it again becomes sort of a struggle for the reader to understand where the sentence is going. So a good rule of thumb is that the subject of your sentence, in the beginning of the sentence, should be at most 8 words long. And I found that to be generally also a very useful rule of thumb. Okay, so moving on to high-level research paper structure. Basically, in order to understand how to write a research paper, you need to understand first, I think that the buck stops first at the program committee, because when you submit a paper to a conference, the first people who are going to read your paper are the program committee, the members of the program committee for that conference. So you have to understand how are they reading the paper? And in general, I mean, this is not just a matter of, how do you get your paper accepted? It's a question of understanding the way that the program committee reads the paper will be reflective of how many people read your paper, which is basically at a somewhat more shallow way than you might want. And so if you understand what they are looking for when they're reading the paper, that will actually help you in communicating to a much broader audience. So how does it work, right? When you submit your paper to a conference like ICFP, there's some program committee that has the program chair of the conference has assembled. This happens to be the program committee for the POPL conference earlier this year. And what happens is your paper is then assigned to a handful of reviewers, somewhere between, typically it ends up being somewhere between 3 and 5 reviewers. After that point, basically it's in their hands, especially now that our program committee meetings are mostly virtual. Then oftentimes, other members of the program committee won't really be involved in discussing your paper, and it'll really be just those 3 to 5 people who are paying attention. So what is the effect of that? Well, there's really 2 things that I think you have to think about. The first is that the program committee is very diverse. So there's always an attempt made to make sure that your paper gets at least one expert review, right? A review from someone who has strong expertise in the area of your paper. And usually there is someone on the PC who's reasonably expert, because the PC is designed to be diverse. That's one of the main jobs of the program chair is to assemble a diverse PC with many different backgrounds. However, that means often that 2 of your 3 reviewers may not be experts on the topic of your paper, and yet you somehow have to communicate them. The other point to note here is that the review period for a typical conference like ICFP is pretty short. So after the papers are submitted, the reviewers have about 2 months to review the papers, sometimes even less. And each PC member may have quite a few papers to review, something on the order of like 15 to 20 papers. In some other conferences, in other areas, it's even more. And so, since they also have like a day job, they have to do research themselves or teach classes or whatever, this often translates into each PC member maybe has less than 1 day to review each paper. And so they have to be able to come to a judgment about your paper, to read it and come to a judgment about it pretty quickly. So what is the impact of these 2 points? So I'm going to first give you sort of 2 overarching points that I would take away from this, and then we'll see how this translates into the more concrete details of paper structure. The first overarching principle I would take away is that is what I call the top-down principle, which is that you should strive to explain your work at multiple levels of abstraction, starting at a very high level that's accessible even to non-experts who may be reviewing or reading your paper, and then getting progressively more detailed. Okay, and this is useful for addressing both of the points on the previous slide. First of all, it's addressing the fact that you're going to have a diversity of reviewers, some of whom are not experts, and even for the experts, it's helpful for them to see the your work presented in this top-down way, because it'll be easier for them to sort of get an intuition for what you're doing before they sort of grapple with all the technical details. The second principle is that because people don't have much time when they're reviewing papers, it's important that you tell them what they want to know. Okay. So don't make them infer all the important things that they're trying to figure out about your paper. Understand what do they want to know about your paper and tell it to them, okay? Obviously, it's then their responsibility to go and check that what you're telling them is actually correct, okay? But nevertheless, it's useful to actually tell them what you think is the answer to the questions they want to know. So, so now I'd like to ask from the audience, write Q if you have a suggestion for what are the things that the reviewers want to know when they're reading your paper. There's quite a few things, so you could. I'm going to highlight 3 of them, but. Has this been done before? So novelty. Contribution, yes. What is your contribution? What is the thing you're doing? Surely they do want to know that. Anything else? Tell them what questions they have, or this is tell them the answers to the questions that they, when they're reviewing the paper, they want to know the answers to certain questions in order to evaluate your paper. Tell them the answers to those questions. Did you succeed in what you wanted? Well, I would hope that you succeeded in what you wanted to do, or else then the paper wouldn't be worth publishing. Implications, impacts, yeah. Why do I care? Yeah, exactly. Why is this actually relevant? Why is this important? Anything else? What ideas did you come up with that might be useful in other contexts? Yes, indeed. Why is this? That's a very good point. A way I like, Stephanie writes, a way I'd like to think about this point is to think of a sentence that I'd like the reviewer to put in their review and add that sentence to the paper. Yes, actually, that's an excellent way of thinking about it. Indeed, I frequently, especially in the introductions of my papers, I try to write things that, that the reviewer could sort of paraphrase in their review. Okay, great. So thank you for all your comments. So yeah, the 3 things that I would put as sort of the first and foremost things that the reviewers want to know is, first of all, how is your work important? Like, what is the important problem that it's solving, and why is that an important problem? Why should the reader care? 2, how is it novel, right? So how is it doing something that hasn't been done before? It doesn't mean it has to be completely solving everything that's not been done before, but what is the thing that is novel that hasn't been done before? And then the third one, perhaps the most controversial of these, I recently got into a Twitter argument with various people about whether this was an important thing. But setting aside whether it's something the reviewers should be asking, it's something they do ask. So it behooves you as an author to try to answer it, which is, how is your work interesting? In other words, what is the thing, is there some ping in the work, some really, elegant idea or something that the reader can take away that they'll be, thinking about when they're taking a shower or something, right? Something they can take away the paper, not just, that, yes, it does important things, but some really, key idea. And someone mentioned here, what ideas did you come up with that might be useful in other contexts? Such an idea would be an example of something that's very interesting. So to me, these are the three most important things that I think about when I'm writing a paper, and this is going to inform my precise suggestions for the structure of the paper. So I want to say one thing that I don't think is that important to tell them, which is, how is your work challenging? So some people think, especially for conferences that focus on more theoretical work, you have to really, impress upon the reviewers that you're street cred, that you're like, that you really pumped iron to get this paper finished. This is not important. Okay, it's perfectly fine to have a beautiful paper that's all about a simple idea that really works well. And in fact, I know of several papers at this very ICFP that have that flavor, and that's perfectly fine. That can be actually a selling point for your paper. It doesn't have to be extremely challenging. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to actually give you now some details in my last, I guess, 10 minutes or so, about a structure that I find works. It's not the only structure, but it's a useful structure. And so if you can make this work, then you have a pretty good structure on your hands. So the basic idea is, you of course, every paper has an abstract. That's a few paragraphs. You have an introduction. That's several pages. Key ideas section. So this is something that you don't find in every paper, and I'll get back to that a little later. But this is a section where you're sort of giving, well, the key ideas of the work. So something sort of lower level in detail than the intro, but higher level than your, the actual technical details, which is presented in the technical meat section, which, as you can see, is the main body of the paper, and then concluding with a related work section. So I'll talk about all of these except for one section. Any guesses which section I'm not going to talk about? No, actually, I am going to talk about the abstract. Yeah, the technical meat section, and there's a good reason for that, which maybe the person who Giuseppe, you might have guessed technical meat because in fact there's only, as you see, 5 readers. Yeah, so I'm sorry to disappoint you, but you work hard. You spend years toiling over your typing rules or whatever, and then in the end only 5 people read them. But that's the reality, is that most people are not going to read your technical meat. Of the people who, of course, build on your work are going to read that technical meat, but most readers aren't. So that's the section, although it's an important section, of course, is the one I'm not going to focus on. And also because it really depends, the structure of the technical meat depends so much on the particulars of your paper. So I'm going to focus on the other sections. Starting with the abstract and intro. So for the abstract and intro, I'm going to present sort of a unified story because basically I sort of apply the same structure to both. And it's what I call the CGI model. So CGI stands for context gap innovation. The context, you first set the stage by motivating the general topic of your paper. You're sort of cluing the reader in, assuming nothing about the reader's background. You're sort of starting from a very high level point and working your way into what is this topic, what is this paper generally about? And leading up to, and this context doesn't necessarily have to be that long. It could be, a paragraph or 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs, but it's just sort of holding the reader's hand until you get to the first really important part, which is the gap. So the gap is where you explain your specific problem and why existing work does not adequately solve it. Okay, so this is a specific instance of the general problem or the general topic, and it's the problem that you are addressing in your paper. Okay, you have to clearly state this gap. I see so many papers where they sort of skip the gap. They talk about context and say there's been a lot of work on this topic, and suddenly they're talking about some contribution. You have to actually state what is the problem you are solving. And then once you've stated that and made it clear what it is, then you can get to the innovation, which is basically your contribution. You state what you've done in the paper that is new, and you explain how it helps fill the gap. I should emphasize it doesn't have to completely fill the gap. Most research doesn't completely fill the gap, right? You have there are some trade-offs in your work, or you handle certain aspects of the problem but not others, et cetera. You make certain assumptions, but you should at least make clear how it helps fill the gap and how it fills the gap in a way that no prior work has. Okay. So I'm gonna just to give you a very simple example, I'm going to show you. Sorry. Before I get there, just to say this is really addressing those two higher level principles, top down and tell me what you want. Tell them what you want to know. It's top down. Obviously, you're starting from higher level and working lower. It also addresses the question of importance in the context and gap parts. That's where you really get the reader to understand why they should care about this work, from starting from not assuming anything about their background. And then novelty, you're explaining exactly in the gap and innovation sections, what is the new thing in this work. Okay. So here's just to give you a very simple example. Here's an abstract for this talk. Learning to write well is an essential part of becoming a successful researcher. That was the context. The gap. Unfortunately, many researchers find it very hard to write well because they do not know how to view their text from the perspective of the reader. And then the innovation. In this talk, we present a simple set of principles for good writing based on an understanding of how readers process information. Unlike such platitudes as be clear or omit needless words, our principles are constructive. One can easily check whether a piece of text satisfies them, and if it does not, the principles suggest concrete ways to improve it. Okay, so this is how I always think about my abstracts and also my introduction. So there are of course differences in how you set up abstracts versus introductions. The introduction is bigger, so you have more space. But this is essentially how I think about it. I should mention that there is an alternative version of the introduction, which a slightly modified version of CGI, where you basically leave out the C, okay, and you just go right to the problem. And this is one that Simon Peyton-Jones recommends in his talk. So he'll often start out with a concrete example, like consider this piece of Haskell code and where it goes wrong. So I think this is great. If you can make this work, it's wonderful because you're getting right into a concrete example, and examples are always great for making the reader understand what the paper is about. The problem I find is that for the kinds of papers I typically write, you can't really do this because there isn't this assumed knowledge. Right? It's not so easy to just give an example of the problem. This works if you're presenting some extension of Haskell, but it doesn't always work for many other topics because it assumes the reader already has too much context. But I thought I'd mention it. If it works, this is great. Okay, so that's the abstract intro. Then moving on to key ideas, and I'll be done in just a few minutes, just for the organizer's sake. So the first question is, why have this section at all? So why bother with a key ideas section? So because many papers don't have one, although increasingly I find they do. But if you look at SIG plan papers from 20, 30 years ago, many of them don't have a key ideas section. And I think the reason why it's so important from my point of view is that it forces you to have a takeaway in your paper. In other words, something interesting. Remember, I mentioned already that the reviewers are looking to find papers that are interesting, that tickles their curiosity. And so by having a key ideas section, you're sort of forcing yourself to come up with something that is a little more interesting that the reviewer can remember. Secondly, many readers only care about that thing, right? So many readers don't really want to read the technical details of your paper, including, I have to be honest, reviewers. So many reviewers will skim the details, but they're not going to read it so carefully, especially if they're not experts. And so they really would like to hear about the takeaway, because that will give them something that they can actually understand from the paper. And then thirdly, even for the experts, for the ones who really do want to understand the technical details, having that key ideas section is useful as a form of scaffolding. It helps the reader sort of build an incremental understanding of what's going on in the paper. And so for all these reasons, I think it's really useful to have a key ideas section if you can. And what actually goes on in the key ideas section, basically, the idea is to sort of explain your contribution or a high-level version of your contribution at the level at which you would explain it if you were talking to someone at the whiteboard, right? You would, which I know is now, we don't have that luxury so much at the moment, unless we're wearing masks or something. Okay, but basically, that's how you could think about it, right? How would you explain something at the whiteboard? You would not show someone, your full type system or all the details of your implementation or whatever. You would show them a concrete example to give them an idea of how it works, okay, on one example or two examples that illustrate the main points. You don't have to show the general solution. You just have to give more concrete illustrative examples of how the thing works. Okay, that's basically all. I mean, there's a lot. Obviously, there's more to say in specific cases, but that's my main point about key idea section is to be concrete. There's one question here that I should answer from James Cooper. Can or should we roll the key ideas section into the introduction, perhaps right at the end of the intro? Yes. In fact, I often do that. I often have a sort of more generalized notion of a key idea section. So sometimes I find it's difficult to even give one key idea section. I have to sort of build up the key ideas incrementally. And in fact, a number of my papers basically are just key ideas. The technical details, a lot of the technical details are too gory to actually even be presented in the paper at all, or more than very cursorily. And so I often spend the whole paper sort of building up the key ideas of the different parts of the work incrementally. And that could start in the introduction. You could start at the end of the introduction with a sort of really, the 1 or 2 paragraph account of your key ideas, and then having sections that come after that. Yeah. Okay. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to go to related work and say one brief slide about that, which is, so many people think that the related work should happen. I've seen a lot of people assume the related work should come right after the introduction. And I would say no. The related work, first of all, goes at the end of the paper. So the reason is the following. So in the introduction, it certainly makes sense to mention some prior work as a way of establishing the gap of the paper, the thing that you're solving that other people didn't. And you can say a bit about the related work there, but a detailed comparison with related work only makes sense after you have described your own work in detail. So you can only really properly compare to related work once you've explained your own, and it makes sense, therefore, to put that more detailed section at the end of the paper. The second point is that you should make sure to give real comparisons in your related work section, not a laundry list. So I've seen many papers where it's clear that the author thought they needed to cite someone, and so they cited them. That's all they did. They just sort of cited them and said, this system exists and does something. And that's not helpful, okay? And it actually kind of pisses off the authors of those papers because, they would actually like to see their paper compared against. So you should be explaining in detail how your work fills the gap in a way that related work doesn't. Okay, so sort of to summarize, I've talked about a bunch of low-level principles: flow via old to new, coherence with 1 paragraph, 1 point, name your baby just in time, and short subjects. And then on the high level, I've talked about the structure of a paper in terms of the CGI model for the abstract and introduction, scaffolding your presentation with the key ideas section, and putting a detailed related work section at the end of the paper. And I think if you think about these principles, you already have a leg up on many other researchers. So hopefully you found that advice. You'll find that advice useful, and I'm happy to take any. If we have any further time, which I don't think we do, I'm happy to take further questions.